Imagine a commander who never tasted defeat, a warrior whose strategies are still studied by modern generals, a man who stepped onto the battlefield again and again, outnumbered, surrounded, even betrayed by the terrain itself, yet always walked out victorious. This is the story of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah. And today we are traveling through every major war he fought, step by step, uncovering how one man reshaped the map of two empires. But here's the real question. Was his success only about strength and courage, or was it something far deeper? Something that turned every impossible scenario into a legendary victory. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our family has reached. Let's start the journey. Khalid ibn al-Walid grew up in a world where strength, loyalty, and quick decisions meant survival. Long before he accepted Islam, the harsh desert shaped him. He wasn't born into comfort. His tribe, Quraysh, trained their youth to ride, scout, and fight from an early age, and Khalid absorbed those skills faster than anyone around him. While other boys were learning basic horse control, he was already mastering tight turns, sudden stops, and long-distance riding across rough ground. It was in these early years that he learned how to read an enemy's movement simply by watching the dust rise behind their horses. What made him different wasn't size or power. It was calculation. He grew up studying the tactics of every tribe he encountered. He memorized their strengths, weaknesses, and the way they formed their lines in battle. Even before Islam, he developed a reputation as someone you didn't want as an enemy. When he trained his men, he pushed them to ride faster, turn quicker, and maintain formation even when scattered by arrows. These were the foundations of the lightning-fast cavalry maneuvers he would later become famous for. Khalid's early life also exposed him to the politics of Mecca. He saw rival clans compete for trade, power, and influence. He learned how alliances were built and how quickly they fell apart. This political awareness shaped his strategic mind. When conflict erupted, he could see the bigger picture behind a fight, not just the clash of swords in front of him. His family expected him to become a leader, and he carried that responsibility seriously. He trained relentlessly, tested himself constantly, and developed the confidence of someone who believed that every obstacle had a solution if he looked at it from the right angle. These skills didn't just make him a warrior, they made him a thinker. All of this happened before he ever knew the message of Islam. His story didn't start on the battlefield of Mu'tah or the plains of Yarmouk. It started here, in the early shaping of a young man who had no idea that history was preparing him for a role far bigger than he could imagine. This foundation sets the stage for everything that came later. The victories, the turning points, the impossible missions. And now with this understanding of his early life, we can move deeper into the journey that transformed him into one of the greatest commanders in human history. The shaping of Khalid's character in his early years sets up a powerful contrast to what happens next. Because the moment his life changes, it doesn't come from a battlefield. It comes from within. Khalid had spent years opposing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He wasn't a man who followed others easily. He questioned, analyzed, and waited until things made sense to him. But gradually the world around him shifted, and the certainty he once had began to crack. He saw the Muslims standing firm in battles where they should have collapsed. He saw their unity and discipline strengthen instead of weaken. And the moment that troubled him most was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. What Quraysh called a humiliation looked to Khalid like a strategic agreement that only a confident and far-seeing leader would accept. These observations stayed with him. They challenged his understanding. They made him pause. What pushed him further was something more personal. His closest friend, Umar ibn al-As, embraced Islam. So did Khalid's brother Walid. Their decisions forced him to reflect deeply. Why were people he respected choosing a path he had spent so long resisting? He didn't want to follow emotion or surrender to pressure. Khalid wanted truth that he could stand behind fully. The turning point came when he quietly admitted to himself that he had been fighting the truth, not defending it. His heart had already shifted before his feet started the journey to Medina. When he finally approached the Prophet, he expected anger or judgment. Instead, he was met with forgiveness, warmth, and a welcome so sincere that it shattered any remaining hesitation. The Prophet placed his hand on Khalid's chest and prayed for him. That moment reset his entire life. His impact was immediate. Khalid didn't need time to adjust or learn. Everything he had trained for suddenly found a higher purpose. He brought discipline, courage, and intelligent strategy into the Muslim army with a level of commitment he had never shown before. His presence lifted morale. His confidence strengthened the weaker lines. His decisiveness started shaping battles before swords were even drawn. This wasn't a man who simply changed sides. This was someone whose entire potential finally aligned with conviction. And the results became clear in the very next chapter of his story. Because once Khalid stepped into the battlefield as a Muslim, the world witnessed a commander unlike anything they had ever seen. With his conversion complete and his purpose renewed, the stage was set for the moment that would transform his name forever. The moment when he would stand in front of an army far larger than his own and change the outcome of a battle the Muslims were on the verge of losing. Khalid's acceptance of Islam brought a new clarity to his life, but its true weight did not appear until he stepped onto a battlefield where everything seemed lost. And that moment arrived at Mu'tah. This was not a small conflict or a simple tribal clash. It was the first time the Muslims faced the full force of the Byzantine Empire, a superpower with trained legions, armored cavalry, and far greater numbers. The Muslim force was only 3,000, sent as a response to the killing of the Prophet's envoy. They expected a targeted mission, not an ocean of enemy soldiers waiting to crush them. What unfolded in the opening hours was devastating. One commander after another fell. Zayd ibn Haritha was struck down, then Jafar ibn Abi Talib, then Abdullah ibn Rawaha. In the span of a single battle, the leadership collapsed, and the army was left trembling between fear and responsibility. This is where Khalid stepped forward. He wasn't the highest-ranking companion. He wasn't even meant to lead that day. But the army needed someone who could think fast, stay calm, and act before chaos swallowed the battlefield. The moment he took command, everything changed. Not because he fought harder than the others, but because he understood the impossible situation at hand. Khalid knew victory was unreachable. The enemy wasn't just larger, they were fresher, better supplied, and confident. What he aimed for was something even harder than winning, saving an entire army from destruction. He had minutes to solve a problem that could have ended the young Muslim community forever. He did not panic. He began reshaping the battlefield piece by piece. He reorganized the cavalry, shifted the infantry, and started rotating units so the Byzantines couldn't guess which line was weakening. At one point, he broke through enemy ranks with such force that several of his swords snapped, leaving only fragments in his hands. Later, people would say he carried 9 broken swords from that day. But the brilliance wasn't in the fighting, it was in the deception. As night approached, Khalid repositioned the army in a way that made the Byzantine commanders believe reinforcements had arrived. The next morning, his lines looked different, his wings appeared stronger, and his movements suggested a larger force preparing for a renewed assault. The Byzantines hesitated. They expected a trap. Khalid used that hesitation to pull the Muslim army back, slowly, carefully, and without breaking formation. By the time the Byzantines realized there was no trap, the Muslims were already far enough to withdraw safely. An army that should have been crushed had survived, and it happened under the command of a man who had embraced Islam only weeks earlier. This battle didn't end with a dramatic victory, yet Mu'tah was the moment Khalid earned the title, the Sword of Allah, not for defeating an enemy, but for saving an entire nation from a disaster that would have changed history. And now, with this turning point behind us, the story shifts into a new phase. Khalid's name was no longer just respected, it was trusted, and that trust would lead him into a series of missions and battles that would reveal what he was truly capable of under the leadership of the Prophet himself. Khalid's role at Mu'tah changed how the entire community saw him, and it also changed the trust placed on him by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. From that moment, Khalid was no longer just a skilled commander. He became someone the Prophet could rely on during missions where precision, discipline, and courage mattered more than numbers. And this new stage in his life began quietly, but its impact grew with every assignment he received. After Mu'tah, the Muslims faced enemies who were unpredictable. Some tribes were preparing to strike, others were watching for weakness, and foreign powers were testing how far this rising community could go. Khalid stepped into this landscape with a focus that matched the responsibility he carried. His missions during the Prophet's lifetime were never about conquest or glory. They were about stabilizing the region, protecting innocent people, and eliminating threats before they grew into full wars. One of his first major contributions came during the conquest of Mecca. Khalid led a column entering the city from the south, not with aggression, but with strict instructions to avoid unnecessary fighting. The goal was to bring Mecca back to peace, not to spill blood. This required a commander who could control his own strength, and Khalid handled it with maturity. Even when a small group tried to resist, he kept the situation contained and prevented it from turning into a larger battle. It was a moment that showed he was not just a fighter, but a leader who understood the balance between firmness and restraint. Soon after, he played a crucial role at Hunain. The Muslim army was ambushed in a narrow valley, and the sudden chaos shook even the most experienced fighters. Khalid stayed steady. He regrouped the cavalry, pushed back against the surprise attack, and helped turn panic into order. These were not moments of loud heroics. They were moments where the survival of the entire army depended on someone who could think clearly while others were overwhelmed. Khalid became that person again and again. He continued to support campaigns aimed at securing distant regions and protecting the growing community. Among these was the expedition to Tabuk, a mission that tested the endurance of every participant. Long distances, harsh terrain, and uncertainty surrounded the journey. Yet Khalid handled his responsibilities with calm discipline, strengthening the confidence of those around him. What stands out is that during these years, Khalid wasn't building a personal legacy. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He was learning. He was absorbing the Prophet's leadership, his discipline, his humility, and his trust in Allah. Every mission Khalid carried out during this period refined him. It sharpened his strategy, deepened his purpose, and prepared him for challenges far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And those challenges were coming fast. Because once the Prophet passed away, the world around Arabia erupted in confusion and rebellion. Whole tribes broke their alliances, false prophets rose, and the unity of the Muslim nation stood on the edge of collapse. This crisis would demand a commander who could restore order with speed and intelligence, without losing sight of justice. The man chosen for that task was Khalid ibn al-Walid, and the battles that followed would push his skills, discipline, and faith to the limits. The passing of the Prophet marked a moment of deep uncertainty. The unity he built began to shake as different tribes across Arabia pulled away, broke their agreements, or followed new voices that claimed prophethood. What had been a stable and growing community suddenly faced a wave of rebellion that threatened to undo everything achieved in the previous years. This is where Khalid's path moved sharply from controlled missions to full-scale crisis management. Abu Bakr, the new leader, saw the danger clearly. If one tribe rebelled, others would follow. If false prophets gained momentum, chaos would spread. The Muslim state was young and vulnerable, and delay could tear it apart. Abu Bakr needed someone who could move fast, strike decisively, and restore order without letting the conflict drag on. Khalid was the only man who fit that role. When Khalid stepped into the early Ridda conflicts, he wasn't facing a single enemy or a unified force. He was facing a landscape where loyalty shifted from village to village, and where every region required a different approach. Some tribes refused to pay zakat. Others challenged the authority of Medina. Some followed rival leaders who promised power and independence. Each situation demanded a specific response, and Khalid had to read the terrain. Not just the physical terrain, but the political and emotional terrain as well. His first moves showed how quickly he adapted. He didn't charge blindly into battle. He studied each tribe's motivations. Some needed negotiation first, others needed a show of strength, and some needed their leaders exposed before the followers realized their mistake. Khalid approached each case with a clear understanding that these weren't foreign enemies. These were people who had been part of the Muslim community only weeks before. That required firmness, but also precision. As the campaigns unfolded, word began to spread. Khalid's arrival meant discipline. His strategies were fast, direct, and aimed at restoring stability before rebellions could link together. Battles were fought, but so were psychological wars, breaking the confidence of false leaders, showing isolated tribes that resistance was hopeless, and pulling scattered pieces of Arabia back toward unity. The early phase of the Ridda Wars wasn't about one grand battle. It was a chain of rapid operations that tested Khalid's endurance and intelligence every day. Each victory made the next one possible, and each mistake could have widened the rebellion. Yet Khalid moved with a determination that matched the urgency of the moment. This opening chapter of the Ridda Wars set the tone for what would follow. The threats would grow stronger, the enemies would become more organized, and soon Khalid would face a confrontation unlike anything he had encountered before. A battle against a figure whose influence was spreading like wildfire and whose followers were ready to fight to the last man. That moment would lead directly into one of the most decisive clashes of the entire era. The early phase of the Ridda Wars set the momentum, but the challenges ahead were far more complex. Among them was the growing influence of Tulayha al-Asadi, a man who claimed prophethood and managed to unite several tribes under his banner. His rebellion wasn't a scattered uprising. It was organized, confident, and positioned in the heart of Najd, where the terrain favored swift attacks and fast retreats. To secure Arabia, this threat had to be dismantled with precision. Khalid understood immediately that defeating Tulayha required more than military strength. Tulayha was charismatic. He promised freedom from Medina's authority and presented himself as a spiritual leader. His followers were motivated and familiar with the rugged land, giving him a dangerous advantage. Khalid's task was not just to break an army, but to break a belief that was spreading quickly. When Khalid advanced toward Najd, he didn't rush blindly. He maneuvered his forces in a way that cut off Tulayha's opportunities to merge with other rebellious tribes. Each movement pushed Tulayha into a tighter corner, reducing his room to escape or gather more support. It was a calculated approach that slowly peeled away his confidence. When the two forces finally faced each other, Tulayha tried to inspire his men with claims of divine visions. He portrayed himself as a chosen leader with heavenly support. But on the battlefield, illusions fade quickly. Khalid's army advanced with discipline, ignoring Tulayha's theatrics. As the clash intensified, Tulayha's claims collapsed under the weight of reality. At the moment he was needed most, he fled the field, leaving his followers stunned and confused. Without his presence, their resistance broke, and Khalid secured one of the most important victories of the Ridda Wars. But his work in Najd was far from over. The region was a patchwork of shifting alliances, and even after Tulayha's defeat, other groups were watching closely to see whether it was safer to rebel or to return to loyalty. Khalid moved swiftly from one area to another, ensuring the rebellion did not reignite. He used a mix of firmness and forgiveness, punishing instigators while allowing many who had been misled to rejoin the community without fear. These campaigns showed a different side of Khalid. He wasn't just a battlefield tactician. He understood human psychology. He recognized when to strike hard and when to open the door for reconciliation. His presence alone often convinced wavering tribes to surrender peacefully, avoiding bloodshed and accelerating the healing of the region. By the time Khalid completed his operations in Najd, the heart of Arabia was stabilizing. The rebellion had lost its momentum, and the path was clearing for the confrontation that everyone knew would define the Ridda Wars. Because while Tulayha's uprising was significant, there was another leader gathering a far larger and more determined force, one whose followers were ready for a final, desperate fight. And that massive confrontation would soon unfold in a battle that would test Khalid like never before. Khalid's victories in Najd brought a sense of stability, but everyone knew the real test was still ahead. All the scattered uprisings, all the false claims and shifting alliances were nothing compared to the storm gathering in Yamama. This was where Musaylima had built his stronghold. He wasn't just another rebel. He commanded a large, disciplined force, and his influence ran deep among his people. His followers believed he was a prophet, and that belief made them fight with a level of commitment that ordinary armies could not match. The Ridda Wars would not end until this threat was confronted. Khalid marched toward Yamama knowing this wouldn't be a quick strike. Musaylima's forces were not only numerous, they were prepared. They held the advantage of familiarity with the land, controlled fortified positions, and had the confidence of a group convinced they were on the right path. But Khalid didn't let the size of the challenge slow him down. He reorganized his troops, drew clear lines of command, and made sure every unit understood its role. This battle demanded discipline more than anything else. When the two sides finally collided, the intensity was unlike previous clashes. Musaylima's warriors fought with a ferocity that shocked even experienced fighters. The battlefield turned into a grind of close combat, with neither side willing to give an inch. At moments, the pressure was so heavy that the Muslim formations nearly buckled. But Khalid kept moving along the lines, reinforcing weak points and rotating units to keep them from collapsing under exhaustion. His presence steadied the army. Whenever the line wavered, he pulled it back together. The turning point came when the Muslim forces pushed Musaylima's army toward their walled garden, a fortified enclosure that would later be remembered as the Garden of Death. It was here that the battle reached its most brutal phase. The narrow entrance created a bottleneck, trapping fighters inside with no room to maneuver. Khalid realized the only way to break the resistance was to push through with overwhelming determination. Once inside, the fight became hand-to-hand, raw and unforgiving. It wasn't strategy anymore, it was endurance. Gradually, Musaylima's men began to fall apart. Their confidence cracked as Khalid's soldiers pushed deeper into the enclosure. Musaylima himself was cornered, and with his death, the resistance collapsed almost instantly. The battle had been costly, but it ended decisively. It broke the backbone of the rebellion and restored unity to Arabia at a moment when everything seemed at risk. The impact of Yamama reached far beyond the battlefield. The heavy loss of Quran memorizers during this fight became the catalyst for one of the greatest projects in Islamic history, the compilation of the Quran into a single written text. The consequences of this battle shaped the future of the Muslim world in ways neither side could have imagined. With the threat of Musaylima eliminated, Arabia moved closer to stability, and Khalid's mission was far from over. The Ridda wars were ending, but a new horizon was opening, one that would take Khalid and the Muslim armies far beyond the Arabian Peninsula into territories ruled by ancient empires. And the next chapter would lead him straight into a region where the challenges were unlike anything he had faced before. The victory at Yamama closed the door on Arabia's internal conflicts, but it also opened a far bigger chapter. With unity restored, the Muslim state could finally turn its attention outward. And the moment that happened, a new frontier appeared, one controlled by one of the oldest empires on earth. This was the land of the Sasanian Persians, highly organized armies, fortified cities, and a history of warfare that stretched back centuries. It was a world completely different from the tribal landscapes Khalid had just stabilized. But once again, he was the man chosen to take the lead. Khalid's entry into Iraq wasn't driven by conquest alone. Many of the Arab tribes in the region had long suffered under Persian rule. Heavy taxes, political pressure, and discrimination pushed them to seek a change. They reached out for support, and Khalid was sent to respond. The moment he crossed into Iraqi territory, the Persians realized they were facing a commander who didn't play by their expectations. The terrain was open, but the political structure was complex. Persian generals relied on large formations of armored infantry backed by war elephants. Their strategy was built on slow, crushing pressure. Khalid approached them with the opposite philosophy: speed, unpredictability, and precise timing. He refused to fight on their terms. His early clashes revealed this difference clearly. Instead of letting the Persians dictate the pace, Khalid moved his forces in rapid strikes, tight, controlled, and aimed at breaking their confidence before breaking their lines. He used the mobility of his cavalry to outmaneuver heavier units and attacked from angles the Persians never prepared for. Victory after victory followed, each one sending shockwaves deeper into the empire. One of the most defining moments came when Khalid achieved what people later called victory after victory in record time. It wasn't because he overwhelmed cities with brute force, it was because he understood how to break the support networks that held the region together. He cut supply routes, intercepted reinforcements, and made sure each battle weakened the next opponent before they even met him. His capture of key towns showed both his discipline and his strategic clarity. Cities that resisted were taken with firmness. Cities that surrendered honorably were treated with fairness and protection. Khalid wasn't just fighting battles. He was building a reputation. Every success made the next negotiation easier. Every negotiation made the next battle smoother. What stands out most in this campaign is how quickly Khalid adapted to an empire-style battlefield. He had spent years dealing with rebellions and desert warfare, but Iraq demanded a different mindset. Fortified positions, Organized legions and complex command structures required a commander who could think several moves ahead. Khalid rose to that challenge with a confidence that surprised even his own soldiers. By the time he secured major sections of Iraq, the Persians realized they were facing a new kind of opponent, someone who understood their strengths, saw their weaknesses, and refused to give them the slow, predictable battles they preferred. Khalid's early Iraq campaign reshaped the balance of power along the empire's frontier and opened a door that had been closed for centuries. But before Iraq fully fell into Muslim control, a new development shifted Khalid's path once again. His victories had begun echoing far to the west, where another ancient empire, the Byzantines, was preparing its own response. And soon Khalid would be called to leave Iraq behind and march into a completely new theater of war, one that would challenge his endurance, his strategy, and the very limits of his leadership. Khalid's success in Iraq sent ripples far beyond the region. Word reached Medina that the Byzantine Empire was gathering its forces in Syria, preparing a massive push to crush the growing Muslim presence once and for all. The threat was immediate and dangerous. The armies already stationed in Syria needed support, and they needed it fast. This meant Khalid had to leave Iraq at the height of his momentum, but how he reached Syria would become one of the most astonishing feats of his entire career. The usual routes between Iraq and Syria were long and heavily monitored. If Khalid moved along those paths, the Byzantines would know exactly where he was and prepare to block him. He didn't have weeks to spare. The armies in Syria couldn't wait. Khalid needed a path no one expected, a route so daring that even the Persians and Byzantines couldn't imagine it being attempted. And this is where his strategic vision reached a new level. He chose to cross the deep desert, a stretch of land so harsh that even seasoned caravans avoided it. There were no wells, no villages, no landmarks, and no margin for error. A single miscalculation could doom the entire force. But Khalid understood that sometimes the impossible path is the safest one because the enemy never prepares for it. He selected a lean cavalry force and prepared them for a journey that required both endurance and absolute trust. To survive the crossing, Khalid used a technique few commanders ever attempted. He brought camels specifically for water storage, allowing the army to travel farther between sources. He timed movements to avoid the deadliest heat and navigated by reading the stars and the slightest shifts in terrain. Every hour mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. As the march continued, the soldiers felt the weight of the desert closing in on them. Endless horizons of sand, no shade, no relief, and a silence that pressed on their minds. But Khalid maintained their morale with calm confidence. He treated the desert not as an enemy, but as a weapon, something he could use to outsmart a far stronger empire. When his army emerged from the desert onto the Syrian frontier, it was as if they had appeared out of thin air. The Byzantines had prepared for reinforcements from the west or the north, but not for an elite force suddenly arriving from a direction they believed impossible. The psychological blow was immediate. The Muslim armies stationed in Syria were relieved and revived by Khalid's arrival, and the Byzantines realized they were now facing a commander whose reach extended far beyond ordinary limits. This desert march did more than move troops. It reshaped the coming war. It merged scattered Muslim forces into a synchronized army, boosted morale at a critical moment, and signaled to the Byzantines that the rules of warfare had changed. Khalid was no longer simply a local commander. He was now at the center of a campaign that would determine the future of entire empires. And with the desert behind him, Khalid turned his attention to the cities and armies that lay ahead. The Syrian campaign was beginning, and the first of its major battles was waiting on the horizon, one that would mark a dramatic shift in the balance of power. Khalid's sudden arrival from the desert changed everything for the Muslim forces in Syria. It sent a surge of confidence through their ranks and caught the Byzantines completely off guard. But that momentum needed a solid foundation. Before facing the major Byzantine armies, the Muslims had to secure a major regional stronghold, Busra. This city wasn't just another target on the map. It was the doorway to deeper Syria, the first major test of unity among the Muslim forces there, and the place where Khalid's leadership would shape the entire direction of the campaign. When Khalid approached Busra, he found Muslim contingents already stationed nearby. They had been holding their position but were hesitant to advance because the city's defenses were strong and its garrison was well prepared. Without a unified command, they risked being pushed back. Khalid's arrival changed that immediately. His presence brought clarity, order, and a sense of direction. What had been scattered groups suddenly became a disciplined army with a single heartbeat. Busra itself stood behind fortified walls, protected by a garrison confident in Byzantine support. They expected the Muslims to hesitate or attempt slow negotiations. Instead, Khalid moved with a balance of speed and strategy. He encircled the city, cutting off movement without rushing into unnecessary bloodshed. His style here wasn't about overwhelming force, it was about showing the defenders that resistance would only prolong an outcome that was already inevitable. Inside the walls, tension grew. The local leaders realized that Khalid was not a commander who wasted time or resources. He offered terms that allowed the city to avoid destruction, but he made it clear those terms would not stay open forever. When the fighting finally began, it was focused and disciplined, with Khalid positioning his forces to weaken the defenders' confidence while minimizing losses among his own men. The turning point came faster than expected. Once the outer resistance broke, the leaders of Busra realized they had no chance of holding the city. They chose to negotiate before the situation collapsed completely. Khalid accepted their surrender under fair conditions, securing Busra without allowing the battle to spiral into unnecessary violence. But what mattered most wasn't simply taking the city, it was taking it together. The Muslim forces, previously acting in separate groups, now operated as a single army under a commander they trusted. Busra became the first major Byzantine-controlled city to fall in the Syrian campaign, and its capture sent a message across the region. The Muslims were not a scattered force passing through. They were an organized army capable of taking fortified cities with precision and discipline. The victory at Busra also marked a shift in Khalid's campaign. It was no longer about responding to threats or stabilizing regions. It was now about confronting the Byzantine Empire head-on. And the first major showdown between these two powers was approaching, one that would test Khalid's tactics on a scale far beyond anything he had faced so far. That confrontation would unfold at Ajnadayn, the next step in a campaign that was rapidly rewriting the balance of power in the region. The fall of Busra did more than expand territory. It sent a shock through the Byzantine command. They had underestimated the Muslims for too long, assuming these were small desert forces that could be scattered whenever the empire decided to take them seriously. But Busra proved otherwise, and the Byzantines realized they had to respond with real strength. That decision led directly to Ajnadayn, the first major, full-scale clash between the Muslim army and the Byzantine war machine. Ajnadayn was not a skirmish or a border fight. It was a deliberate attempt by the Byzantines to crush the Muslim advance in one decisive strike. They gathered a large, disciplined force equipped with heavy infantry, cavalry, and elite units, trained to hold positions under intense pressure. This was an army that had fought Persians, Armenians, and countless uprisings across centuries. They didn't expect the Muslims to survive this encounter, let alone challenge them. Khalid understood exactly what he was facing. This wasn't a battlefield where speed alone would win. He needed coordination, patience, and a formation that could absorb the shock of Byzantine armor while still maneuvering fast enough to break their lines. His army held its positions with remarkable discipline as the Byzantines pressed forward, confident in their traditional advantage of numbers and equipment. What kept the Muslim lines steady was the way Khalid moved along the battlefield, adjusting positions at the precise moments they were needed. He didn't allow panic to spread. He didn't allow gaps to form. Every shift he ordered served a purpose, either to strengthen the defense or to set up the moment he was waiting for. Because Khalid's strength wasn't just in holding ground, it was in identifying the one point where an enemy could be broken. That moment came when the Byzantines pushed hardest. Their heavy infantry began to compress the Muslim center, expecting it to collapse. Instead, Khalid suddenly unleashed his cavalry from the wings, striking the Byzantine flanks with speed they were completely unprepared for. Their disciplined formation faltered. Their confidence cracked. What they expected to be a slow, crushing advance turned into a desperate attempt to reorganize under pressure. The shift was dramatic. As the Byzantine lines bent under the sudden assault, the Muslim center surged forward instead of falling back. The battlefield flipped. What had been a moment of danger for the Muslims became a moment of collapse for the Byzantines. Their soldiers began retreating unevenly, breaking the very structure that gave their army its strength. By the end of the clash, the Byzantines suffered heavy losses, and their surviving units had no choice but to withdraw. Ajnadayn became the first major Byzantine defeat in the Syrian campaign, and its impact was enormous. It proved that the Muslims could stand toe-to-toe with one of the world's strongest armies. It forced the empire to abandon the idea that this was a minor rebellion, and it placed Khalid at the center of every strategic discussion the Byzantines held afterward. But most importantly, Ajnadayn opened the road deeper into Syria. The victory broke the psychological barrier that had protected Byzantine territories for generations. Cities and garrisons began to watch Khalid's movements with fear instead of arrogance. Yet the campaign was far from over. The Byzantines were wounded, not defeated, and they were preparing another stand. The next battles would demand even more adaptability from Khalid, especially in landscapes that challenge every traditional tactic. And that challenge appeared next at Fahl, where terrain, not just the enemy, would test his mastery of the battlefield. The victory at Ajnadayn shook the Byzantine command, but it didn't end their resistance. Instead, it pushed them to regroup and choose ground they believed would give them the upper hand. That ground was Fahl, a region wrapped in marshes, flooded fields, and uneven terrain. It was the kind of battlefield where traditional cavalry movements became difficult, and where a small mistake could trap entire units in mud and water. The Byzantines believed this terrain would neutralize Khalid's speed and give their heavier formations the advantage they needed. But they underestimated how quickly he could adapt to an unfamiliar landscape. When Khalid approached Fahl, he immediately saw the challenge. The enemy had positioned itself behind natural barriers, turning the land itself into part of their defense. A direct charge would have been reckless. So instead of rushing, Khalid studied the ground carefully. He examined the soft patches, the shallow paths, the firmer ridges, and the points where movement was still possible. It wasn't the wide-open desert he preferred, but it was a puzzle he could solve. The Byzantines held their position confidently, expecting the mud to slow any Muslim advance. They wanted to force Khalid into a predictable pattern, something they could defend against with their solid infantry lines. But he refused to give them that comfort. He shifted his approach constantly, pressing on one side, then suddenly pulling back, then probing another weak point. Each maneuver forced the Byzantines to adjust, breaking the static formation they relied on. Once their focus was divided and their lines were strained, Khalid struck with precise timing. His cavalry didn't charge blindly into the marshes. They moved through the narrow, stable paths he had identified earlier. The infantry followed in tight formations, protecting each other from slipping into the weaker ground. The Byzantines were caught off guard. They expected the land to slow the Muslim advance, but Khalid had turned that same land into an advantage. Their own defensive position became a trap as they struggled to maneuver in the very terrain they thought would save them. The battle that followed was intense in close quarters. There was no room for sweeping cavalry arcs or dramatic flanking movements. This was a grinding fight, determined by discipline, patience, and the ability to stay coordinated while the ground gave way underfoot. Khalid's men held their structure far better than the Byzantines anticipated. Step by step, they pushed the enemy backward until the entire defensive line began to crack. When the Byzantines finally attempted to retreat, the same marshes that had protected them now blocked their escape. The Muslim forces pressed forward, tightening the pressure until the remaining resistance collapsed. Fahl fell, and with it, one of the key defensive points in the Jordan Valley. This victory mattered for more than territory. It proved that Khalid wasn't limited to deserts or open plains. He could fight and win on ground specifically chosen to stop him. It also showed the Muslim armies that no terrain could stand in the way as long as they had discipline and a commander who understood how to read the battlefield. With Fahl secured, the Byzantine forces were now being pushed deeper into retreat. Their next stand wouldn't be just another attempt to defend a city or a region. It would be an all-out attempt to stop the Muslims once and for all, and that final decisive confrontation was waiting at Yarmouk. The battlefield stretched across open plains, rocky slopes, and deep ravines. It was a place where both armies could maneuver, but also where a single mistake could trap entire units. Khalid studied every corner of the terrain. He knew the Byzantines relied on heavy infantry and large formations, while his own strength came from mobility, discipline, and precise timing. The landscape wasn't just neutral ground, It was a chessboard, and every move he made would change the outcome. The Byzantine force was massive, made up of different ethnic armies pulled from across the empire. They had numbers, armor, and prestige. The Muslims were fewer, but they had something the Byzantines didn't: unity under a single command. Khalid made sure every soldier knew exactly where to stand, when to hold, and when to move. He restructured the army into flexible units, each capable of responding to sudden pressure without breaking formation. When the battle began, the Byzantines struck with confidence. Their goal was to push the Muslims back toward the ravines, trap them, and crush them through sheer force. The initial assault tested the Muslim lines intensely. Wave after wave pressed forward, hoping to break the right or left flank just enough to create a collapse. But Khalid didn't allow any point to weaken for long. He moved constantly along the battlefield, reinforcing wherever the pressure grew strongest. His ability to read the shifts in momentum was extraordinary. Before cracks had time to widen, he was already filling them. The battle stretched not for hours but for days. Each side fought through exhaustion, heat, and uncertainty. The Byzantines tried every tactic they could: direct charges, flank pushes, sudden retreats meant to lure the Muslims forward. But Khalid recognized each move as it unfolded. His army didn't chase traps. They didn't fall for feints. They held their ground until the right moment arrived. And that moment came when the Byzantines began to overextend themselves. Their massive formations required perfect coordination, but after days of fighting, their lines weren't as tight as they had been at the start. Fatigue created gaps. Mixed contingents didn't respond to commands with the same speed. Their discipline, the core of their strength, began to fade. Khalid seized the opportunity. He reorganized his cavalry with breathtaking speed, turning them into a concentrated strike force. While the Byzantines pushed forward in the center, Khalid sent his cavalry around the wings, sweeping into the enemy's flanks with a ferocity they never expected. It wasn't a single charge. It was a continuous wave of pressure that bent the Byzantine formation out of shape. Once their flanks began to fold, their center had no support, and the entire command structure spiraled into confusion. As the Byzantines attempted to retreat, the landscape turned against them. The ravines that had been behind the Muslim lines at the start of the battle now trapped the fleeing soldiers. Panic spread. Units that once stood proud and orderly were now scrambling to escape the tightening circle Khalid had created around them. The Muslim army pressed forward, maintaining formation as the Byzantine resistance broke down completely. By the end of the battle, the Byzantine army was shattered. Thousands fell, others fled, and Syria was effectively lost to the empire. Yarmouk wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point in world history. It marked the decline of Byzantine control in the region and paved the way for a new era in the Middle East. For Khalid, Yarmouk became the ultimate example of his mastery. It combined strategy, patience, maneuvering, psychological insight, and endurance all in one battle. No other clash displayed his genius so clearly. Even military historians, centuries later, would study Yarmouk as a model of perfect battlefield management. But the story doesn't end there. Victory on the field didn't protect Khalid from the changes happening in Medina. Despite his unmatched contributions, a new chapter was approaching. One that would test not his strength on the battlefield, but his humility and obedience off it. The triumph at Yarmouk marked the height of Khalid's military brilliance. Few commanders in history ever achieved such a complete, decisive victory against a world power. His name spread across the region, admired not only by his own soldiers, but also whispered with respect among his enemies. Yet at the very moment when people expected his influence to grow stronger, a completely different test awaited him, one that had nothing to do with armies or battlefields. It came from Medina, from the leadership of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and it would reveal the depth of Khalid's character more clearly than any military triumph. After Yarmouk, the Muslim world was expanding rapidly. Every victory increased Khalid's fame, and people naturally began to celebrate him as the hero of the era. Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, saw something dangerous in this. Not dangerous in Khalid himself, but in how people might slowly attach victories to a man rather than to Allah. Umar feared that admiration could turn into dependence, and dependence could turn into imbalance. He wanted the community to understand that success didn't come from any single individual, no matter how gifted. but from unity, justice, and divine support. So Umar made a decision that shocked many. He removed Khalid from his position as commander. The timing was astonishing. The empire had just suffered a historic defeat at Yarmouk. The Muslims were entering a delicate phase of expansion, and yet the man who had delivered victory after victory was suddenly ordered to step aside. The message carried no anger, no criticism. It wasn't about punishment or mistrust. It was about protecting the spiritual foundation of the community at a time when admiration could easily turn into dependency. For ordinary people, the decision was difficult to understand. For generals, it would have been unbearable. But for Khalid, it became a moment that defined him even more than his battlefield achievements. When the letter reached him, he didn't argue. He didn't complain. He didn't gather supporters or attempt to challenge the decision. He read the order, accepted it without hesitation, and handed command to Abu Ubaidah on the spot. It didn't matter that he had led armies across continents. It didn't matter that he had never been defeated. What mattered was obedience, loyalty, and humility. And then, without stepping away from the battlefield, he continued fighting as a regular soldier. Imagine the scene. A commander who had defeated Persians, Byzantines, false prophets, and rebel coalitions, now riding into battle not as a general, but as a soldier under someone else's command. No change in attitude, no bitterness, no pride, just pure commitment. His courage didn't fade, his skill didn't diminish. In fact, he fought even harder, as if to prove that his loyalty was not tied to rank, but to the mission. This moment became one of the most powerful lessons of his life. It showed that Khalid's greatness wasn't limited to strategy or warfare. It came from his ability to surrender his ego, to accept a decision he didn't fully understand, to continue with the same passion, even when the spotlight moved away from him. Umar's decision and Khalid's response created a story that has been preserved for generations, not as a tale of conflict, but as a lesson in leadership on both sides. Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, protected the unity of the community. Khalid protected the purity of his intention. And in this balance, history witnessed something rare. A commander who proved his strength in war and his humility in obedience. With this turning point behind him, Khalid's life entered its final phase. One that did not involve grand battles or sweeping campaigns, but a quiet ending filled with reflection, dignity, and the legacy of a man whose imprint on history would never fade. Khalid's response to his dismissal revealed a side of him that many people had never seen, a quiet, unshakable humility. Even after stepping down from command, he continued to fight with the same fire and devotion as before, proving that his commitment was to the mission, not to his rank. But battles eventually slowed, the world he had helped reshape began to stabilize, and Khalid moved into the final years of his life, years that contrasted sharply with the thunderous campaigns he had once led. With no great wars left to fight, Khalid lived more quietly than most would expect from a man who had reshaped the fate of empires. He carried the scars of countless battles, each one a reminder of the life he had lived on the front lines. Yet despite everything he had accomplished, he owned very little. Wealth had never interested him. Power had never controlled him. He spent his final years without land, without luxury, and without the comforts that many commanders before him had taken for granted. What weighed on him most during this time wasn't regret, but the irony of his destiny. After surviving battles against overwhelming odds, after riding into the thickest parts of combat again and again, he found himself leaving the world not by the sword, but by illness. This thought pained him deeply, not out of fear, but out of longing. He once said that no place on his body remained free of a scar from battle, yet he was dying on his bed like an ordinary man. Those words weren't pride. They were a reflection of a warrior whose life had been shaped by constant struggle. But his sadness never turned into bitterness. In those final days, he understood that his journey had been written with purpose. Every victory, every hardship, every sacrifice had played a part in something much larger than himself. The Ummah he fought to defend was now stable. The territories he had helped open were thriving, and the message he had dedicated his life to had spread far beyond the borders he once knew. His passing marked the end of an era, but his legacy had only begun. History would remember him not only as a brilliant strategist, but as a man who combined courage with obedience, strength with devotion, and victory with humility. Generals from different civilizations would later study his tactics. Historians would debate his maneuvers. Leaders would quote his discipline and his unwavering loyalty. But the people who knew his story understood something deeper. Khalid wasn't just a warrior who won battles. He was a believer who fought with purpose, conviction, and sincerity. His legacy lived on through the worlds he changed. The Ridda Wars, the campaigns in Iraq, the battles in Syria, and the decisive triumphs against empires all carried his touch. His influence shaped military strategy for centuries, and his dedication became a symbol of what unwavering faith and commitment can achieve. Khalid ibn al-Walid left this world quietly, but his memory never faded. His life remains a testament to what a single individual can accomplish when courage is matched with discipline, when talent is guided by sincerity, and when power is always balanced with humility. And with his story coming to an end, our journey through his battles reveals a greater truth. Khalid was more than a commander. He was a phenomenon, one whose impact echoes long after the sound of swords has vanished. If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments which part of Khalid ibn al-Walid's journey inspired you the most. And if you want more powerful historical documentaries like this, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next story.